hot and steamy act like that. Alright, so we cue these slides. So you've seen this. This is a highly technical, scientific thing that shows up in a lot of journal articles. So we talk about the Earth as the habitable zone where bears are, and where bear attacks can happen. But that's also the space where we're just far enough from the sun that we don't burn up. We're not too far away that we freeze. So that's kind of the perfect spot where the geothermal energy coming out of the ground is balanced by the cooling that goes off into space. Because there's great geothermal energy on the other rocky planets, and there is geothermal energy out in on Neptune, Uranus, Saturn, Jupiter, of course, but between PV equals nRT, thank you for a great gas reference. But not enough heat's escaping to the surface, and of course the gas giants don't have surfaces. Here, there's too much solar energy and there's too much getting to the surface. So we're in that bear attack zone where the geothermal is balanced with the distance from the sun. So it's kind of a system that works together. So the planetary formation that created the geothermal energy in the first place, given our position in the solar system, is responsible for why we're still here. So we can talk a little, we can switch from the kind of the big astrophysical realm now more towards kind of what would happen. Can we use up all the geothermal energy? Could we somehow refrigerate the planet? And the answer is no. There's just so much energy down there. Now we can refrigerate a little bit of the planet. If you have one well, and then right next to it, a well where you're producing water out of and injecting cooler water down into, you can cool things off there, and that's called heat mining. And that's what the geothermal industry tries to avoid, because then you won't have any more energy, at least from those two wells. So ideally, when you pull water out of one well, you want to do it at least a mile away, and there's technical aspects as to how the water flows between the two wells. But in general, you want to bring it out far enough away that when you put the cooler water back in after you've made power, then it'll reheat naturally to the surface of the earth and you get a big cycle going. And that will work whether you're doing direct use, which is where you're not making power, but you're using lower temperature geothermal for heating houses, cooling houses, doing any sort of drying. Industrial heating and cooling can be up to 40% of a building's energy use. So not necessarily making power, but using it for heating and cooling still avoids a lot of load pull from the grid. And that's a very important aspect of energy use. So we think of geothermal as a waterfall, of course, because it's a water reference, where we use the higher temperature resource to make power, and then when we've used up that amount of temperature, we can use the rest of it for direct use. So using both those style of resources is ideal. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about how sometimes it's not a slide. There it is. So in geology, we love food analogies because you can think of the earth as a 7-layer bean dip, cakes, bread cut bread has faults in between it, etc. That's a whole different show. It's just food use in the sciences, particularly geoscience. But when you deal with wells, when you deal with things in the subsurface, the previous the skit where they talked about there's no money in getting a startup going. That's it's been feast and famine, mostly famine at the outset. But it's tough getting things going in a high capital world. You're doing things in the subsurface. It's expensive to work with wells. And so sometimes geothermal energy isn't always the cheapest option, but we can think of our choice of energy sources like eating a bunch of hamburgers from your favorite burger chain. Or, cue the next slide, you can think of a farm-to-table vegan meal. Yes, both styles of food and both styles of meal will sustain you, but will they sustain you well, and will they sustain the community around you? So geothermal is not unique in that it is, I'm not saying it's the only really great community-based renewable energy. Wind and solar certainly are too. It's one of the only baseload renewable energies, and that baseload aspect is important. It's on at 2 a.m. and it's on at 3 p.m. when the sun's shining really, really, really hot. We're not relying strictly on the sun. We're not relying on wind power, so it's always there. And we can choose how we get our energy. We can choose the slightly more expensive, sometimes, sources that are better for you, or we can choose the cheap ones, like coal and other fossil fuels. And sometimes petroleum has its place in the energy mix, but increasingly in an electrified world, wind, solar, and power from geothermal can provide all the baseload power that one needs when it's night, when the wind isn't blowing, etc. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll really enjoy your questions if we have any time for them at the very end, and I might be around at the bar afterwards to answer some questions as well. So thank you again for your attention.